The pediatric nurse smiled warmly as she adjusted the little girl's foreline, her gentle hands moving with practiced care. Parents trusted her. Children adored her. For over a decade, she'd been the angel of mercy at the children's hospital, the one who volunteered for extra shifts, who sang lullabies to crying babies, who never complained about the hardest cases. But what no one knew, what no one could have possibly imagined, was that this same woman had murdered 13 people, and she was planning her 14th victim at that very moment. Her name was Genene Jones, and she was one of the most terrifying serial killers in American history. Not because she used weapons or violence in the traditional sense, but because she used her position of absolute trust to kill the most vulnerable victims imaginable, babies and children under her care. Asterisk if you want to hear more chilling true crime stories like this, subscribe to Cold Truffles with Alex. Hit that subscribe button now, because the story you're about to hear will leave you questioning everyone you think you know. Asterisk. Genene Jones didn't fit the profile of what most people imagine when they think of a serial killer. She wasn't a shadowy figure lurking in dark alleys. She wasn't a social outcast or an obvious monster. She was a respected healthcare professional, a mother, a colleague who brought donuts to work and remembered everyone's birthday. Born 1950 in San Antonio, Texas, Genene grew up in what appeared to be a normal middle-class family. She was adopted as an infant and raised with love and care. Nothing in her childhood screamed future murderer. She wasn't abused. She didn't torture animals. She seemed, by all accounts, ordinary. But there was something lurking beneath that ordinary surface. Something dark and hungry that craved attention and power in the most twisted way possible. Genene became a licensed vocational nurse in 1977 and started working at Behar County Medical Center Hospital in San Antonio. She specialized in pediatrics, specifically in the intensive care unit where the sickest children fought for their lives. It was demanding work, emotionally exhausting, and required someone with nerves of steel and a deep well of compassion. Genene seemed perfect for the job. She was efficient, knowledgeable, and appeared deeply committed to her young patients. When a child took a turn for the worse, Genene was often the first to notice. She'd call the code, alert the doctors, and spring into action with life-saving measures. Sometimes she succeeded in bringing a child back from the brink. Sometimes she failed, and she'd cry genuine tears over the loss. Or so everyone thought. It started with whispers, quiet conversations between doctors who noticed something strange. The pediatric intensive care unit had always been a place where children sometimes died. That was the tragic reality of working with critically ill kids. But around 1981, something changed. The death rate was climbing. More children were having unexplained cardiac arrests and breathing emergencies. More babies were coding for no clear medical reason. And when the doctor started comparing notes, they noticed something chilling. Genene Jones was present for almost every single one of these emergencies. At first, they tried to explain it away. Maybe she just had bad luck with her shift assignments. Maybe she was such a good nurse that she was always placed with the sickest children. Maybe it was coincidence. But the numbers didn't lie. During the period when Genene worked in the ICU, there were between 25 and 50 suspicious deaths and near-death episodes. When children were under her direct care, they had a death rate that was 10 times higher than when other nurses were on duty. Dr. James Robotham, one of the physicians, started keeping detailed records. He noticed that these emergencies followed a pattern. They usually happened during Genene's shifts, often in the late evening or early morning hours when fewer people were around. The children would suddenly stop breathing or their hearts would suddenly stop beating, despite being stable just minutes before. Even more disturbing, when doctors performed toxicology tests on some of the children who'd suffered these mysterious episodes, they found something terrifying: high levels of drugs that had no medical reason to be in their systems. Specifically, they found succinylcholine, a powerful paralytic drug used during surgery to paralyze muscles, including the muscles needed to breathe. In the wrong hands, it was the perfect murder weapon. It stopped the victim from breathing, causing cardiac arrest, and it broke down quickly in the body, making it hard to detect unless you were specifically looking for it. They also found excessive amounts of heparin, a blood thinner that could cause fatal hemorrhaging, and digoxin, a heart medication that could stop a child's heart in overdose. Genene was injecting these drugs into her patients. She was slowly murdering children. But why? That's the question that haunted investigators then and continues to baffle criminal psychologists today. Why would a nurse deliberately harm the children she was supposed to protect? The answer lies in a psychological condition called Munchausen syndrome by proxy, though even that doesn't fully explain the depths of Genene's depravity. Genene craved attention and admiration. She wanted to be seen as a hero, as the miracle worker who could bring dying children back from the edge. So she created the emergencies herself. She'd inject a child with a lethal dose of medication, wait for the inevitable crisis, then spring into action as the savior. Sometimes she'd successfully rescue the child she'd just poisoned, earning praise from grateful parents and impressed colleagues. Other times, she'd let them die, basking in the sympathy and attention that came with being the nurse who'd tried so hard to save a dying child. It gave her a sense of power and control. In those moments of crisis, she was the center of attention. Doctors hung on her every word. Parents looked to her with desperate hope. She was important. She mattered. And if children had to die to feed that need, that was a price Genene Jones was more than willing to pay. By late 1981, the medical staff at Behar County Medical Center knew something was terribly wrong. The evidence was mounting. The statistical anomalies were impossible to ignore. Several doctors were convinced that someone on staff was deliberately harming patients, and all signs pointed to Genene Jones. But here's where the story takes an even darker turn. The hospital administration didn't want to believe it. Or more accurately, they didn't want to deal with it. Accusing a nurse of murdering children was explosive. It would destroy the hospital's reputation. It would open them up to massive lawsuits from the families of dead children. It would be a media nightmare. And proving it would be incredibly difficult, the drug testing was expensive and not always conclusive, and medical records from that era weren't always complete. So instead of firing Genene outright and reporting her to authorities, the hospital made a decision that would cost more lives. In March 1982, they quietly forced her to resign without explicitly stating why. They gave her the option to quit rather than be terminated, and they provided a neutral reference letter that said nothing about the suspicions against her. They essentially passed the problem to someone else. Genene Jones left Behar County Medical Center without any criminal charges, without any mark on her nursing record, and without any warning to future employers about what she might have done. The hospital administration thought they'd solved their problem. The mysterious deaths and emergencies stopped after Genene left, which seemed to confirm their suspicions. But they'd actually unleashed a serial killer into the wider world, free to kill again. Genene didn't waste time. Just weeks after leaving the hospital, she found a new job at a pediatric clinic in Kerrville, a small town about 60 miles northwest of San Antonio. Dr. Kathleen Holland had just opened her practice and needed an experienced pediatric nurse. Genene's resume looked impressive, and her reference letter from the hospital said nothing alarming. Dr. Holland hired her immediately. For a few weeks, everything seemed normal. Genene was professional, knowledgeable, and good with the young patients. Dr. Holland felt lucky to have found such an experienced nurse for her new practice. Then the emergencies began. Children who came in for routine checkups suddenly stopped breathing. Babies who were there for minor illnesses went into cardiac arrest. It happened again and again, always when Genene was alone with the child for a few minutes. The first major incident involved a 15-month-old baby named Chelsea McClellan. She'd been brought to the clinic for a routine checkup and some immunizations. She was a healthy, happy toddler with no medical problems. Genene took Chelsea to an examination room to prepare her for the shots. A few minutes later, she called out that Chelsea had stopped breathing. Dr. Holland rushed in to find the baby in full cardiac arrest. They managed to revive her and had her rushed to a hospital in San Antonio. Chelsea survived that day, but Dr. Holland was shaken. Healthy babies didn't just stop breathing for no reason. Then, just a few weeks later, Chelsea's mother brought her back to the clinic for a follow-up visit. Again, Genene was alone with Chelsea for just a few minutes. Again, the baby suddenly stopped breathing. This time, despite desperate efforts to save her, Chelsea McClellan died. Chelsea's death devastated her family and shocked the small community of Kerrville. But it also finally triggered the investigation that should have happened years earlier. Dr. Holland was suspicious. Too many children were having emergencies at her clinic, and they all seemed to happen when Genene was alone with them. She started reviewing her medical supplies and made a horrifying discovery: bottles of succinylcholine and other drugs were missing. Someone had been stealing them. She immediately fired Genene and contacted authorities. Meanwhile, investigators in San Antonio had been quietly looking into the deaths at Behar County Medical Center. They've been gathering medical records, interviewing staff, and building a case. When they heard about the incidents in Kerrville, they realized they were dealing with the same killer. The scope of Genene's crimes was staggering. Over the course of several years, working at 2 different medical facilities, she'd murdered or attempted to murder dozens of children. The exact number would never be known. Many of the deaths at the hospital had been written off as complications from the children's underlying illnesses, and medical records from that era were incomplete. But investigators could prove at least some of the cases. They exhumed Chelsea McClellan's body and performed new toxicology tests with more sensitive equipment. They found succinylcholine in her tissues, proof that she'd been murdered. They interviewed other families whose children had died or nearly died under Genene's care. They reviewed medical records and found patterns of drug theft and suspicious incidents. They built case after case. In 1984, Genene Jones was arrested and charged with murder. The trial was a media sensation. How could a nurse, someone sworn to heal and protect, deliberately murder the children in her care? How could someone who seemed so normal, so dedicated to her job, harbor such darkness? Prosecutors painted a portrait of a deeply disturbed woman who craved attention so desperately that she was willing to kill for it. They brought in expert witnesses who explained Munchausen syndrome by proxy and how it could drive someone to harm those in their care, just to be seen as a hero when saving them. They presented the toxicology evidence, showing that Chelsea McClellan had been injected with a paralytic drug. They showed records of missing medications that corresponded with Genene's shifts. They brought in testimony from doctors and nurses who'd witnessed her suspicious behavior. The defense tried to argue that Chelsea had died of natural causes, that the presence of succinylcholine could be explained by normal medical procedures. But the evidence was overwhelming. Multiple children had suffered the same mysterious symptoms while under Genene's care. The statistical probability of that being coincidence was essentially zero. Most damning of all was testimony from Genene herself. Under questioning, she made statements that revealed her twisted psychology. She talked about how she felt called to work with the sickest children. She described the rush of adrenaline when a child coded and she had to spring into action. She seemed to relish the memory of being at the center of those life or death moments. Even when confronted with evidence of her crimes, she showed no real remorse. She was angry at being caught, angry at the hospital for not supporting her, angry at the doctors who questioned her. But she showed no empathy for the children she'd killed or their devastated families. In 1984, Genene Jones was convicted of murdering Chelsea McClellan and sentenced to 99 years in prison. She was also convicted of injuring another child, Rolando Santos, and received a concurrent 60-year sentence for that crime. But here's the truly infuriating part of this story. She was scheduled to be released in 2018. Because of the way sentencing laws worked in Texas at the time, even though she'd been given a 99-year sentence, mandatory release laws meant she would only serve about 1/3 of that time. Despite being one of the most prolific serial killers in American history, despite murdering babies and children, she was going to walk free. The families of her victims were horrified. Prosecutors scrambled to find a way to keep her behind bars, and they succeeded, but only barely. In 2017, just as her release date approached, prosecutors in San Antonio brought new charges against her for murders that had occurred at Behar County Medical Center decades earlier. They charged her with killing 5 babies at the hospital in 1981. These cases had been investigated at the time, but never prosecuted, partly because of the difficulty of proving murder in a medical setting and partly because she was already facing other charges. But with Genene's release looming, prosecutors reopened these cold cases. In 2018, Genene pled guilty to killing 5 babies and was sentenced to life in prison. She'll never be released now. Justice, delayed by decades, finally caught up with her. Behind the statistics and legal proceedings were real children with real families who loved them. Their names deserve to be remembered. Chelsea McClellan was just 15 months old when Genene killed her. She was a bright, happy toddler who loved playing with her brothers and sisters. Her mother, Petty McClellan, spent decades fighting to make sure Genene stayed in prison. Rolando Santos survived Genene's attack, but suffered permanent brain damage. His family watched helplessly as their vibrant baby was reduced to a shell of himself by the drugs Genene injected into him. At Behar County Medical Center, the victims included tiny premature babies fighting for their lives, children with treatable illnesses, who should have gone home healthy, and toddlers who'd come in for minor procedures and never left alive. Many of them were from poor families who trusted the hospital to care for their children. They had no reason to suspect that the friendly nurse in the ICU was a predator. They believed she was trying to save their babies, not kill them. The exact death toll will never be known. Investigators believe Genene may have killed as many as 60 children during her nursing career, but they could only prove a handful of cases. The rest of her victims were buried with causes of death listed as complications from their illnesses, and their families never knew they'd been murdered. Genene Jones's killing spree lasted as long as it did because of multiple system failures at every level. First, the hospital administration chose reputation management over patient safety. When they suspected Genene was harming patients, they should have immediately removed her from patient care, conducted a thorough investigation, and reported their findings to law enforcement and the state nursing board. Instead, they quietly pushed her out the door with a neutral reference, allowing her to get another job where she could kill again. Second, there was no system in place to track healthcare workers who moved between facilities. Genene could simply apply for a new job, and her new employer had no way of knowing that her previous hospital had suspicions about her. Even today, this remains a problem. Healthcare workers who are fired or forced to resign from one facility can often find work at another without their new employer knowing about problems at their old job. Third, the early 1980s were a time when medical surveillance wasn't what it is today. Hospitals didn't have sophisticated systems for tracking medication use or flagging unusual patient outcomes. It was easier for someone like Genene to steal drugs and harder for administrators to spot patterns in patient deaths. Fourth, there was a cultural reluctance to believe that a nurse could be a killer. Nurses were seen as angels of mercy, selfless caregivers who devoted their lives to helping others. The idea that one could be a cold-blooded murderer seemed impossible. This cognitive dissonance made it harder for people to see what was right in front of them. Genene Jones belongs to a particularly disturbing category of serial killers: healthcare workers who murder their patients. Over the years, there have been dozens of similar cases around the world. These killers are often motivated by attention-seeking behavior, sometimes diagnosed as Munchausen syndrome by proxy. They create medical emergencies so they can be the hero who resolves them. They thrive on the drama, the adrenaline rush, and the attention and praise they receive. Some are motivated by a twisted sense of mercy. They believe they're ending the suffering of patients they see as hopeless. Others enjoy the power and control that comes from holding life and death in their hands. Still others seem to kill simply because they can, because they've discovered they have the power to end lives and get away with it. What makes these killers particularly dangerous is their position of trust. Patients and families are completely vulnerable to their healthcare providers. We trust doctors and nurses with our lives and the lives of our children. We assume they're working to heal us, not harm us. This trust gives medical killers enormous opportunity. They have access to lethal drugs and vulnerable victims. They can easily disguise murders as natural deaths or medical complications, and they're often the last people anyone would suspect. Genene Jones exploited this trust to its fullest extent. She used her position as a pediatric nurse to gain access to the most vulnerable victims imaginable: sick babies and children who couldn't fight back or tell anyone what she was doing to them. She used her medical knowledge to select drugs. That would be hard to detect. And she used the chaos of a busy hospital to hide her crimes in plain sight. Looking back at Genene's career, there were red flags that should have been noticed earlier. Understanding these warning signs is crucial for preventing similar cases in the future. First, there was the statistical anomaly. Children died at dramatically higher rates when Genene was on duty. This kind of pattern should trigger immediate investigation at any medical facility. Second, there were the missing medications. Controlled substances like succinylcholine should be carefully tracked, and any unexplained shortages should raise alarms. Third, there was Genene's behavior during emergencies. Several colleagues noted that she seemed almost excited when a child crashed, that she appeared to enjoy the drama and attention. While healthcare workers need to stay calm under pressure, there's a difference between professional composure and inappropriate excitement. Fourth, there were the near misses. Many children had mysterious episodes while under Genene's care, but survived. These should have been investigated more thoroughly at the time. Fifth, there was the pattern of emergencies happening when Genene was alone with patients. This is a common feature in medical murder cases. The killer waits until there are no witnesses before administering the lethal dose. Finally, there was the fact that the emergencies stopped when Genene was removed from patient care. This should have been the clearest proof that she was the cause. Today, hospitals have better systems for tracking these kinds of patterns. Many have special committees that review unexpected patient deaths and look for statistical anomalies. Medication tracking is more sophisticated, and there's greater awareness that healthcare workers can be killers, making people less reluctant to report suspicions. But even with these improvements, medical murders still happen. Healthcare facilities must remain vigilant and willing to act on suspicions, even when those suspicions involve trusted staff members. While Genene's confirmed victims can't tell their stories, some of the children who survive her attacks have spoken out as adults. Rolando Santos, who suffered permanent brain damage from the drugs Genene injected into him, lived with severe disabilities for years before dying young. His family has spoken about the ongoing trauma of knowing that a nurse they trusted had deliberately harmed their baby. Other families have shared similar stories: children who came in for routine care and left with mysterious injuries or illnesses, parents who trusted Genene and felt betrayed when they learned the truth, siblings who grew up in the shadow of a tragedy that never should have happened. Many of these families didn't learn the truth for years. They thought their children had died from medical complications or rare diseases. When they finally learned that their babies had been murdered, they had to relive the trauma all over again. Some families have channeled their grief into advocacy, pushing for better safeguards in hospitals and changes to laws that would make it harder for killer healthcare workers to move between jobs. They fought to keep Genene in prison and to make sure her victims aren't forgotten. Their courage in speaking out, despite the pain it causes them, has helped prevent future cases by raising awareness about this type of crime. Was Genene Jones born evil, or did something make her this way? It's a question that has fascinated criminal psychologists and true crime followers for decades. By all accounts, Genene had a relatively normal childhood. She was adopted into a loving family and showed no early signs of violent tendencies. She didn't torture animals or hurt other children, the typical early warning signs of a developing psychopath. Some experts believe she developed her pathology later in life, perhaps as a response to feelings of inadequacy or powerlessness. As a nurse, she found a way to feel important and powerful by creating life-or-death situations that she could control. Others argue that the capacity for such evil must have always been there, hidden beneath a veneer of normalcy. They point to accounts from people who knew Genene before her crimes were discovered, who describe her as self-centered, attention-seeking, and lacking in real empathy despite her outward show of caring. The truth is probably somewhere in between. Genene may have had underlying personality traits: narcissism, lack of empathy, need for attention that were manageable in most contexts, but found a deadly outlet when combined with opportunity and the ability to rationalize her actions. What's clear is that by the time she started killing, she'd lost any normal sense of morality or empathy. She could look at a sick baby and see not a human being deserving of care and protection, but a tool she could use to make herself feel important. She could inject a toddler with lethal drugs and then comfort the grieving parents, feeling no apparent guilt or shame. Whether we call that evil, insanity, or severe personality disorder, the end result was the same. Children died horrible, unnecessary deaths at the hands of someone who should have been protecting them. Genene Jones's case, along with other similar cases around the world, has led to significant changes in how healthcare facilities handle potential problems with staff members. Most hospitals now have protocols for investigating suspicious patterns of patient outcomes. If a particular doctor or nurse is involved in an unusual number of deaths or emergencies, that triggers a review. Statistical analysis is used to identify patterns that might indicate a problem. Medication tracking has become much more sophisticated. Controlled substances are monitored electronically, and any discrepancies are immediately investigated. It's much harder now for a nurse to repeatedly steal drugs without being caught. There are also better systems for sharing information between healthcare facilities. While it's still not perfect, there are now databases and background check systems that can reveal if a healthcare worker was fired or forced to resign from a previous job for patient care issues. Many states have strengthened their laws requiring healthcare facilities to report staff members to licensing boards when there are concerns about patient safety. The old practice of allowing someone to quietly resign without reporting the underlying problems is now illegal in most places. There's also greater awareness and training about the possibility of healthcare worker killers. Medical students, nursing students, and hospital administrators learn about famous cases like Genene Jones as cautionary tales. They're taught to recognize warning signs and to take suspicions seriously rather than dismissing them as impossible. However, challenges remain. Healthcare facilities still sometimes prioritize protecting their reputation over patient safety. There's still reluctance to believe that a trusted colleague could be a killer. And healthcare workers who are good at their crimes can still evade detection for years. After Genene's conviction, the families of her victims faced a new battle, making sure she never got out of prison. As her scheduled release date approached in 2017, Petty McClellan, Chelsea's mother, led a campaign to keep Genene behind bars. She organized other victims' families, worked with prosecutors to bring new charges, and spoke to the media about the danger Genene still posed. Petty described the horror of knowing that the woman who'd murdered her baby daughter might soon walk free. She talked about the nightmares, the anxiety, the feeling that justice had failed. Other families joined her cause. Parents who'd lost children at Behar County Medical Center decades earlier came forward to share their stories. Some had never known that their children had been murdered. They'd been told the deaths were from medical complications. Learning the truth, after all those years, reopened old wounds. Together, these families put enough pressure on prosecutors and lawmakers to ensure that Genene faced new charges before she could be released. Their advocacy directly led to Genene's 2018 guilty plea and life sentence. Their fight also helped change Texas law regarding early release for violent offenders. The mandatory release laws that would have freed Genene were reformed to give prosecutors and judges more discretion in cases involving serial killers and other dangerous criminals. These families turned their grief into action, ensuring that their children's deaths would not be in vain. Their courage in reliving their trauma to keep a killer behind bars is a testament to the power of a parent's love. Today, Genene Jones is serving a life sentence in a Texas prison. She's in her 70s now, an elderly woman who spent most of her adult life behind bars. Reports from prison indicate she's been a difficult inmate over the years. She's filed numerous appeals and complaints, claiming she was wrongly convicted and that she's the real victim in all of this. She's shown little genuine remorse for her crimes. Some who've interacted with her in prison say she still craves attention and plays mind games with guards and other inmates. Even in prison, removed from any position of power or trust, she still exhibits the narcissistic traits that drove her to kill. she'll never be released. The life sentence she received in 2018 ensures she'll die in prison. For the families of her victims, that brings some measure of peace, even if it can never bring back the children she murdered. The case of Genene Jones teaches us several crucial lessons about evil, trust, and the systems we create to protect the vulnerable. First, we must remember that monsters don't always look like monsters. Genene seemed like a dedicated nurse, a caring professional, someone who could be trusted. Evil can hide behind a friendly smile and a caring demeanor. We can't assume that someone is good simply because they're in a helping profession or because they seem nice. Second, institutions must prioritize safety over reputation. The hospital that quietly pushed Genene out rather than reporting her and investigating thoroughly bears responsibility for the deaths that followed. When there's suspicion that someone is harming patients, institutions have a moral and legal duty to act, even if it's embarrassing or costly. Third, we need better systems for tracking and sharing information about problem healthcare workers. Genene was able to move from the hospital to the clinic because no one warned Dr. Holland about the suspicions against her. Better information sharing could have saved lives. Fourth, statistical anomalies in healthcare outcomes should always be investigated. When death rates spike or one worker is involved in far more emergencies than their colleagues, that's a red flag that can't be ignored. Fifth, we must be willing to believe victims and take their concerns seriously. Some families who lost children at the hospital had suspicions that something wasn't right, but their concerns were dismissed. Healthcare providers need to listen when patients and families raise concerns, even if those concerns seem unlikely. Finally, we must recognize that some people are capable of unimaginable evil. Genene Jones murdered babies, the most innocent and helpless victims possible. She did it for attention, for a rush of adrenaline, for a sense of power and control. Understanding that such people exist and can operate in any setting, even trusted institutions, is crucial for preventing similar tragedies. In the years since her conviction, one question has haunted investigators, victims' families, and true crime followers. How many children did Genene Jones really kill? We know about Chelsea McClellan and the other children for whom there was enough evidence to bring charges. But what about all the other suspicious deaths during her time at Behar County Medical Center? What about incidents at other facilities where she might have worked before San Antonio? Some investigators believe the true death toll could be as high as 60 children. Others think it might be even higher. The problem is that many of these deaths occurred decades ago. Medical records are incomplete, and bodies were buried or cremated without thorough toxicology testing. For families who lost children during the time Genene was working, this uncertainty is torture. They wonder, was my child one of her victims? Did my baby die from natural causes, or was he murdered? They'll likely never know for sure. This is the hidden cost of medical murder. Beyond the confirmed victims, there are dozens or even hundreds of people who will forever wonder if their loved one was killed by a trusted healthcare provider. That doubt, that not knowing, is its own form of trauma. In the end, the story of Genene Jones isn't really about her. It's about the children whose lives she stole and the families she destroyed. It's about Chelsea McClellan, a bright-eyed toddler who should have grown up to graduate from high school, maybe gone to college, fallen in love, had children of her own. Instead, she died in agony at 15 months old, murdered by someone her mother had trusted to care for her. It's about the tiny premature babies in the ICU at Behar County Medical Center, fighting for every breath, who died not from their illnesses but from deliberate poisoning by the nurse who was supposed to be monitoring their vital signs and keeping them safe. It's about Rolando Santos and the other children who survived but were left with permanent injuries from the drugs she injected into them. They lived, but their lives were forever diminished by what she did to them. It's about the parents who trusted the healthcare system to care for their sick children and instead had those children stolen from them. The mothers and fathers who've lived for decades with grief and guilt and rage. It's about the siblings who grew up without their brothers and sisters, in families forever marked by tragedy and loss. These are the real victims of Genene Jones's crimes. These are the lives that matter, the stories that deserve to be told and remembered. Genene Jones will die in prison, hopefully soon and hopefully forgotten. She doesn't deserve to be remembered. She doesn't deserve to have her name live on in true crime history as anything other than a warning about what evil looks like when it hides behind a caring smile. But the children she killed deserve to be remembered. They deserve to have their stories told. They deserve justice, even if that justice came decades too late for most of them. And we, as a society, have a duty to learn from this horror. We must remain vigilant against those who would abuse positions of trust. We must create and maintain systems that protect the vulnerable. We must be willing to believe the unbelievable when the evidence points in that direction. Because somewhere out there, right now, there might be another Genene Jones. Another healthcare worker who's discovered the power to harm rather than heal. Another predator hiding behind professional credentials and a caring demeanor. The only way to stop them is to watch for the signs, to take suspicions seriously, and to put patient safety above all other concerns, even when it's uncomfortable, even when it seems impossible, even when we desperately want to believe that such evil couldn't possibly exist in our hospitals and clinics. That's the legacy of Genene Jones's crimes. A hard lesson about trust, evil, and the price of looking away when something doesn't seem right. It's a lesson written in the blood of innocent children, and one we must never forget. If this story affected you, if it made you think about trust and evil and the systems we create to protect the vulnerable, then subscribe to Cold Truffles with Alec for more in-depth true crime stories that examine not just the crimes, but the human cost and the lessons we must learn from them. Hit that subscribe button because these stories need to be told, and the victims deserve to be remembered.